Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? I wasn't planning to drive this late. The highway had been empty for miles, the glow of my headlights bouncing off the cracked asphalt. I should have pulled over an hour ago, but every gas station I passed looked abandoned, and every rest stop felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. I told myself I'd stop at the next safe place. Then I saw the sign. Nighthaven RV Park, open, sunset to sunrise. It was old, barely hanging from a rusted pole, and the words were painted in faded red letters. Something about it made my stomach twist, but exhaustion was gnawing at my brain. I checked my GPS. No results. I checked my Maps app. Nothing. I even Googled the name. Not a single mention of it online. But when my headlights hit the turnoff, a smooth gravel road stretched ahead, lined with dim, flickering streetlights. It looked normal. I hesitated. I was miles from the nearest town, running low on gas, and I could feel my eyes growing heavier. This place, whatever it was, had power, space, and other RVs parked in neat rows. It seemed like the safest option, so I turned in. The park looked too perfect. As my tires crunched over the gravel, I scanned my surroundings. The park was bigger than I expected. Maybe 24 lots, each neatly spaced apart, some occupied, some empty. Small lanterns lined the road, casting a soft yellow glow. A check-in office sat at the entrance, but it was dark. No clerk, no sign-in sheet, just a small wooden sign on the door that read, "Pay before you leave." That was weird. Most places asked for payment up front. Still, I found a spot near the edge of the lot, away from the others, and killed the engine. The quiet was immediate, pressing in like a thick fog. I sighed, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I was overthinking things. I was just tired. I stepped outside, stretching my sore muscles. The air was oddly warm for this late at night. A little humid, even. Then I noticed something else. The stars looked strange. I don't mean they were brighter or dimmer. I mean the constellations were wrong. Orion was missing. The Big Dipper was twisted, out of place. And there were clusters of stars I'd never seen before, packed too tightly together, glowing too fiercely against the black sky. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. I shook it off. Maybe it was just light pollution, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Either way, I needed sleep. I climbed back into the RV, locked the doors, and shut the curtains. Just a few hours, I told myself. I'd be gone before sunrise. Then I heard footsteps. The first sign something was wrong. I froze. Soft, slow footsteps crunched outside my RV, circling around the back. I held my breath, listened. Someone was walking, barefoot, across the gravel. I grabbed my phone, fingers hovering over the flashlight button. But I hesitated. Something about those footsteps felt off, like they weren't in a hurry, but they wanted me to know they were there. I stayed still, barely breathing. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. My heart pounded. Then, just as I reached for the lock, the footsteps started again, moving away. I exhaled slowly, forcing my body to relax. Probably just another camper, I told myself. Someone out for a late-night walk. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been listening. I double-checked the locks, pulled my blanket over my head, and squeezed my eyes shut. Just a few hours of sleep, I reminded myself. Then I was gone. I drifted off. A conversation that made no sense. I woke up to the sound of low voices outside my window. My breath hitched. I checked my phone. 3:12 a.m. The voices were too muffled to understand, but I could tell at least 3 people were talking, whispering. Then a woman laughed softly, a short, choked sound, like she was trying to hold it in. I swallowed hard, my body stiff with tension. Who the hell was outside my RV at this hour? I reached for the curtain, hesitating. Then I heard my own name, clear as day, spoken by a voice I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold. I yanked the curtain back. No one was there. Nothing but empty lots and the flickering streetlights. But the voices hadn't stopped. They had just moved, further away. I heard laughter again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning didn't feel like morning. At dawn, I expected to hear birds, bugs, the usual sounds of morning. But the air was silent, and something about the light was wrong. I stepped outside, blinking against the sky. The sun was rising, but the color was off, too orange, almost reddish, like a permanent sunset. The other RVs were still parked. No one had left. I glanced toward the entrance. and my stomach dropped. The sign was gone. The one that said open, sunset to sunrise. Now the wooden post stood empty, as if nothing had ever been there. A cold sweat prickled my skin. I swallowed hard, telling myself I was just imagining things. I just needed to leave. I turned back toward my RV, ready to grab my keys, and nearly ran into a man standing behind me. "How long have you been here?" I jumped back, my heart slamming into my ribs. The man was in his late 40s, with sunken eyes and dark circles so deep they looked bruised. He was wearing old jeans, a faded flannel, and no shoes. "Morning," he said, his voice dry cracked. I forced a nod. "A morning." He looked at my RV. "Just passing through?" "Yeah," I said quickly. I was about to hit the road. His expression didn't change. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been here?" I frowned. "What?" He tilted his head slightly. "How long have you been here?" Something about the way he asked made my skin crawl. "Just one night," I said. He didn't blink. "Are you sure?" The air felt colder suddenly. My breath hitched. I opened my mouth to answer, and then a woman's voice called from across the park. "Leave him alone, Sam." I turned. A woman stood a few lots away, arms crossed, staring at us. She was younger, maybe mid-30s, but her face looked just as tired as the man's. Sam sighed, shuffled away. I let out a shaky breath, forcing a nervous chuckle. Weird question, right? The woman didn't laugh. Instead, she took a step closer and said, very quietly, "Don't stay another night." I stared at her. "What?" She shook her head, eyes darting toward the other RVs. "Leave before sunset." I felt a pulse of fear in my chest. "What happens at sunset?" She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away. Something was very, very wrong. I rushed back to my RV, heart racing. I needed to leave. Now. I yanked the door open, climbed inside, and shoved my key into the ignition. I twisted. The engine didn't start. I twisted again. Nothing. I slammed my palm against the wheel. "Come on." Then, from outside, soft, slow footsteps crunched against the gravel, circling my RV, like they were waiting for me to step out. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tight. The sun had barely risen, but already I had the sinking, gut-churning feeling. I wasn't going to make it out before dark. I tried the key again. The ignition clicked, but the engine refused to turn over. I checked the battery gauge. Full. No warning lights. No reason it shouldn't start. My stomach twisted. I was trapped. The woman's warning echoed in my head. "Don't stay another night." I didn't plan to. But if my RV wouldn't start, what choice did I have? I took a deep breath, trying to think logically. Maybe my starter was acting up. Maybe the sudden chill in my gut was just exhaustion, not fear creeping into my bones. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with this place. And I was running out of time to figure out what. No one would admit the truth. I climbed out of the RV, stepping onto the gravel. The park felt off in the daylight. Not just empty, wrong. The air was thick, humid, like the atmosphere before a storm. The gravel beneath my feet looked unnatural. Too smooth, too even, like it had been placed there recently. And then there were the other campers. No one was setting up chairs, cooking breakfast, or even stepping outside. Just waiting. A few RV doors were open, but no one made eye contact. A man sat in a lawn chair, staring at the horizon. A woman stood beside a camper, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. They all looked tired, like they hadn't slept in weeks. I spotted the woman from earlier, the one who warned me. She was standing near a rusted airstream, her gaze locked on me. I made my way toward her. She didn't look surprised when I approached. "You tried to leave, didn't you?" she said softly. I swallowed hard. "My RV won't start." She exhaled slowly, nodding like she already knew. "They never do." A chill raced down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing toward the others. A few of them looked away quickly. "No one ever leaves," she murmured. "Not until it lets you." My skin prickled. "It?" Before I could ask, Sam, the man who confronted me earlier, strode up. "Stop filling his head with nonsense," he snapped. The woman flinched but didn't argue. I turned to Sam. "Then tell me what's going on." He exhaled sharply. "Look, your RV's probably just acting up. It happens. Someone will give you a jump later." "Later?" I pressed. "Why not now?" He didn't answer. Instead, he clapped a hand on my shoulder and said, "You should get some rest." The word sent a bolt of fear straight to my gut, because the way he said it, flat, mechanical, rehearsed, made my skin crawl. I pulled away from his grip, heart pounding. "I'm fine," I muttered. Sam just nodded, too quickly, and walked off. The woman didn't say anything, just turned and locked her RV door behind her. And suddenly, I felt like I was the only one in the park who still cared about getting out. The empty office. If no one would help me, I'd help myself. I headed to the check-in office near the entrance. Maybe there was a landline, a directory, something that could get me in touch with the outside world. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. No clerk, no computer, just a desk and a ledger. I flipped through the pages, rows of names, dates, but something was wrong. The earliest entry was from 1967, and the same names kept appearing over and over. I checked the last few pages, my hands trembling. My name was there, in faded ink, not from last night, not from this year, but from 1983. My breath hitched. That was impossible. I hadn't even been born in 1983. My hands trembled as I flipped further back, desperate for an explanation. Then, something scratched from behind the desk. I froze. It was faint, a slow dragging sound, like nails against wood. I took a step back. The sound stopped. I swallowed hard, pulse hammering in my ears. Then, the phone on the desk rang. The wrong voice on the line. I stared at the phone, heart pounding. It was an old rotary model, the kind that shouldn't even be working anymore. It rang again, and again. The moment I touched it, the ringing cut off. I hesitated, then slowly raised the receiver to my ear. Static, faint at first, then louder, like a swarm of insects buzzing against my skull. Then a voice. "You're still here." My stomach dropped. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar, like my own, only distorted. Before I could say anything, it whispered, "Don't let them see you when the sun sets." Click. The line went dead. I slammed the phone down, my chest heaving. And from outside, I heard laughter. Not friendly, not normal. Thin, hollow, too many voices at once. I turned toward the window, and saw figures standing at the edge of the lot, watching. They weren't there before, and they weren't campers. You need to hide. I stumbled out of the office, the world spinning around me. The figures at the lot's edge weren't moving, just waiting. Too tall, too thin, their faces hidden in shadow. The sun was starting to sink. I needed to get out. I sprinted toward my RV. The moment I reached the door, a hand grabbed my wrist. I nearly screamed, but it was the woman from earlier. Her grip was tight, desperate. "Listen to me," she whispered. "You can't be outside when the sun goes down." I glanced back at the figures. They hadn't moved. Yet. "What are they?" I choked out. She shook her head. "I don't know. No one does. But they're not here during the day." I swallowed hard. "How do we stop them?" Her eyes darkened. "We don't." The sun sank lower. The street lights flickered on, a dim, sickly yellow glow. And suddenly the park felt smaller, like the night was closing in. She squeezed my wrist one last time and whispered, "Lock your doors. Don't open them, no matter what you hear." Then she ran. I scrambled inside my RV, bolted the locks, and pulled the curtains tight. Outside, the figures were closer now, their silhouettes shifting, stretching. Their faces were still hidden in darkness. And I had the sickening feeling that the moment the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, I'd finally see what they really looked like. Final thought before the sun disappeared. The last light faded, and I realized something. The sign at the entrance had lied. The park didn't just open at night. It only existed at night. And I was trapped inside it. I sat in the driver's seat, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Outside, the darkness felt alive. Not just the absence of light, something deeper. Something watching. The figures at the edge of the lot had vanished. But that didn't mean they were gone. I reached for the ignition, not expecting much. I turned the key. Click. Nothing. My breath hitched. Then, from outside, tap, tap, tap. My stomach dropped. The sound wasn't coming from the windshield. It was coming from the back window of the RV. I turned my head, my pulse hammering in my ears. A handprint was pressed against the glass. But it wasn't right. Too long. The fingers stretched unnaturally, smudged against the window like something trying to push through. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying to keep my breathing steady. Then, another handprint, and another. They multiplied across the glass, pressing from the outside, smearing, clawing. I lunged for the curtains and yanked them shut. The tapping stopped instantly. But I wasn't foolish enough to believe that meant I was safe. I backed away from the window, my heart beat a frantic drum in my chest. Then, the radio clicked on. The wrong broadcast. It shouldn't have been possible. The radio was off. No power. No reason for it to suddenly crackle to life. But it did. Static filled the RV, hissing through the speakers. Then, a voice. Low. Hollow. At first, it was just a murmur buried under the static. Then I heard my own name. I stiffened. You shouldn't be here. I swallowed hard, my fingers hovering over the dial. The voice was too familiar. Then I realized why. It was mine. Distorted. Hollow. Like it had been recorded years ago and left to rot on an old cassette tape. I reached out with a trembling hand and turned the volume knob. The static cut out. Silence. Then, you have to get out before the next sunrise. I jerked my hand away as if burned. The voice wasn't just mimicking me. It was talking to me, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The speakers crackled again, and then it said something worse. They already know you're listening. I lunged for the knob and turned the radio off. The static lingered for a second too long, as if the voice wasn't ready to let me go. Then the RV fell into complete silence, and something scratched against the door. Something is inside. I spun toward the door. The handle rattled. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. I staggered backward, my breath coming in quick gasps. A single knock. Then two. Then 4 rapid taps, too fast to be human. I clamped my hands over my ears. Don't open the door. That's what the woman said. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself against the RV wall. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it. Breathing. Not outside. Inside. Right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the dark interior of the RV. My own reflection stared back at me from the microwave door. Wide-eyed. Panicked. Then, it blinked. But I didn't. The mirror that watches back. I froze. My reflection didn't move. Didn't mimic my panicked breathing. Didn't follow the slight tremor of my fingers. It just stared at me. Then its lips curled into a slow, wrong smile. I wasn't smiling. I stumbled back, my breath shuddering in my throat. The microwave screen darkened, as if something behind my reflection was leaning closer. A shape. A figure standing behind me. I turned. Nothing. Just empty space. I whipped back to the microwave. My reflection was gone. But the glass was still fogged up, like someone had just breathed on it from. Oh. Search. Reason. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The RV felt smaller now, the air too thick to breathe properly. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows, shifting like something unseen was circling the vehicle. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, like the air itself was pushing down on me, urging me to stay still. Then the engine roared to life on its own. My stomach dropped. I hadn't touched the key. The gas gauge ticked up from empty to full in a single unnatural motion, and the headlights flicked on, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. Except, it wasn't empty anymore. Surrounded by the forgotten, figures stood outside the RV. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. They weren't people. Not anymore. I couldn't make out their faces, but their silhouettes twitched unnaturally, as if they were struggling to hold their forms together. They were thin, stretched like shadows cast at the wrong angle, and all of them were staring right at me. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones. The figures didn't speak. They didn't move closer. They just watched, like they were waiting for me to realize something. Then I saw it, the RV's rearview mirror. It wasn't reflecting the inside of the vehicle anymore. It was showing something else. The road that loops forever. The mirror wasn't reflecting me. It wasn't reflecting the inside of the RV at all. Instead, it showed a road I recognized. The same twisted highway I had driven down hours ago. The road that led here. But there was something wrong with it. It wasn't just a reflection. It was moving. The road stretched into an endless loop, bending, curving, folding in on itself like a Mobius strip. And in the distance, headlights. My stomach twisted. The RV in the mirror wasn't just any RV. It was mine, and I was still in it, driving toward the park. The realization hit me like a truck. I never left. I had never left. I was stuck here, caught in some endless cycle, returning to the park over and over again, forgetting each time, just like the others before me. The figures outside? They weren't people anymore. They were the ones who never escaped, and I was about to join them. Unless I broke the loop. The rules were a lie. My heart pounded. I had to break the loop. I scrambled for the ignition, but the key wasn't where I left it. My mind raced. The woman's warning echoed in my head. Don't leave after sunrise. Don't open the door. Don't answer the knocking. But if the loop was real, if I was trapped, then the rules didn't matter. The rules were part of the trap. I grabbed the door handle. I had no choice. Either I broke out now, or I'd wake up tomorrow with no memory of any of this. Just another shadow, watching the next arrival. The knocking started again. Louder this time. Desperate. And then, the door unlocked on its own. I held my breath. Then slowly, I pushed it open. A step into the unknown. The air outside was wrong. Not cold, not warm, just empty. Like a vacuum, waiting to swallow me whole. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, surrounding the RV, their hollow faces stretching in my periphery. I took a step forward, and suddenly, I was somewhere else. The path out, or the final trick. The RV was gone. The park was gone. I stood on the twisting highway from the mirror, stretching endlessly into the horizon. A thick, dark fog rolled across the pavement, swallowing the road behind me. There was only one direction to go. Forward. I ran. The road tilted beneath me, like it wasn't meant to be walked. The air pulsed, carrying a distant sound. A car engine. I ran faster. The fog thinned. And then finally, I saw headlights. An RV. My RV. Barreling straight toward me. And behind the wheel, a version of myself. Eyes glazed. Mouth slack. The version of me that was still trapped. I had seconds to decide. Run back. Jump? Take my own place? I didn't think. I lunged. Straight into the headlights. And then, everything went black. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No feeling. Just darkness. Then, the smell of coffee. The hum of an engine. I gasped awake, gripping the steering wheel. The road stretched ahead, empty and familiar. I looked to the side. The clock on the dashboard read 5:37 a.m. Sunrise was coming. And behind me, in the rearview mirror, the park was gone. But I knew better. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting. For the next traveler to find it. Or for me to return. Because deep down, something told me. I never really left. I never really left. That thought clung to me like a sickness. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent except for the steady hum of the RV's engine. The sky was beginning to lighten, a dull orange glow bleeding across the horizon. Dawn. I checked the clock on the dashboard. 5:37 a.m. Almost morning. And yet, the back of my neck prickled with unease. In the rearview mirror, the park was gone. But was it? I swallowed hard. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I had no memory of pulling onto the highway. No memory of leaving the park. No memory of anything after stepping into the headlights. It felt like a jump cut in a movie, like time had been snipped away. Had I really escaped? Or had the park just let me go? A hole in my memory. The sky brightened. The world looked normal again. The trees lining the road were nothing more than trees. The yellow lines on the asphalt were cracked but ordinary. No flickering lights. No shifting shadows. But my head ached. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake the feeling that something was missing. Then I noticed the notebook on the passenger seat. I didn't remember putting it there. Did I even own a notebook? Hesitantly, I picked it up. The cover was worn and weathered, stained with something that looked too dark to be dirt. My stomach churned as I flipped it open. Page after page, filled with my own handwriting. I flipped to the first entry. You've been here before. My own words stared back at me, written in hurried, frantic strokes. You won't remember this tomorrow. But you have to try. You have to write it down. The park is a trap. A loop. Every time you leave, you forget. But it doesn't forget you. I flipped ahead. They watch from the edges. They don't speak. I think they were people once. I think they were like me. Another entry. You have to break the loop. But I don't know how. Every time I get close, it resets. I wake up back on the road. It always ends the same. My pulse pounded in my ears. I flipped to the last page. The words were scrawled, shaky, as if I had been writing in the dark, just before losing consciousness. If you're reading this, then it's already happening again. I dropped the notebook. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I had been here before, over and over. How many times? How many times had I driven down this same road, thinking I had escaped? How many times had I forgotten? And more importantly, how much longer before it happened again? The sound in the static. The RV's radio crackled to life. The speakers had been silent the whole drive, until now. A slow, familiar static filled the cabin. I reached for the knob, heart hammering, and turned the volume down. The static didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. And underneath it, a voice. Muffled, distant, then clearer. "Can you hear me?" I nearly swerved off the road. The voice was my own. A message from myself. I stared at the radio, my mouth dry. The voice crackled again. "If you're hearing this, then you forgot." Again. No, this couldn't be real. I was losing my mind. The voice, my voice, continued. "The notebook is real. Read it. Read all of it. And don't go back. Don't stop. No matter what happens, don't stop driving." I gripped the wheel tighter. The radio whined, the signal distorting. The voice broke apart, warping into something else. A sound I didn't recognize. Something laughing. Something trying to mimic my voice, but failing. The laughter twisted, turning into a garbled whisper. Then, silence. A shadow on the road. The static was gone, but the damage was done. I was shaking all over, struggling to keep the RV steady. I had heard myself, a version of myself who had been through this before. But if that was true, why did I remember leaving the park? Had I ever left? I had to keep going. I pressed my foot on the gas, speeding up. The sun was rising higher now, spilling light across the cracked highway. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Not a shadow, not a hallucination. A person, the figure that shouldn't exist. I slammed on the brakes. The RV screeched to a halt just inches away from the figure. And that's when I saw their face. It was me, my own face. But wrong. Empty. My reflection stood on the road, staring back at me with hollow eyes, mouth slightly open. It raised a hand, pointed back the way I had come, back toward the park. The message was clear. You belong here. The choice that wasn't a choice. I refused to accept it. I wouldn't go back. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there pointing. A chill crawled up my spine. I looked at the clock. 5:59 a.m. 1 minute until sunrise. I pressed my foot on the pedal and drove straight through it. For a split second, I felt nothing. No impact. No resistance. Then, a sharp, piercing laughter rang through the air. I didn't look back. I just kept driving. Final warning. The sun was up. The world looked normal again. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. But I knew the truth now. The park wasn't just some place you visited. It followed you. It stayed inside your mind, waited in the cracks of your memory. And one day, I would wake up in that parking lot again. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget, the park would find me again. It always did. And next time, I might not escape. Next story. A peaceful arrival, or so it seems. I wasn't looking for anything strange. Just a quiet night. Just a place to park the RV, get some rest, and move on in the morning. The sky was already dark by the time I pulled into Whispering Pines Campground, a small, out-of-the-way RV park tucked into a dense forest. The road leading in had been nearly invisible, no signs, no markers, just a narrow dirt path that looked barely used. I should have questioned that, but I was tired. The park itself was small, maybe 10 spots total, each nestled beneath towering pine trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. The place had a stillness to it, like the trees were holding their breath. A few other RVs were scattered around, their porch lights glowing softly. Some looked old, others newer. At first glance, it seemed normal, cozy even. I pulled into a spot near the edge of the campground, right next to a sleek white RV. It looked brand new, polished exterior, LED porch light glowing warmly, a small fire pit crackling in front of it. And beside the fire, a man sat in a fold-out camping chair, sipping from a metal cup. He looked up as I parked, smiling easily. A friendly wave. For some reason, it made me hesitate. Meeting the camper. I've met plenty of travelers at campgrounds before. It's part of the charm. You trade road stories, give each other tips on places to visit, maybe share a drink before heading off in different directions. This guy seemed no different, just another traveler stopping for the night. He stood as I stepped out of my RV, late 40s, maybe early 50s. Rugged, but not in a threatening way. Worn jeans, a dark flannel, and a baseball cap pulled low over sharp, observant eyes. "Evenin'," he said, tipping his cup toward me. "Didn't think we'd get another guest this late." His voice was calm, casual but oddly deliberate. I shrugged. "Long drive. This was the closest stop I could find. He nodded like he understood. Yeah, this place is quiet. Not a lot of people know about it. That's why I like it. Something about that sentence stuck in my head. Not a lot of people know about it. I glanced around. Despite the handful of RVs parked nearby, I realized I hadn't seen a single other person moving around. No one walking to the bathrooms. No dogs being taken out for a last walk. Just silent RVs with glowing windows. I turned back to my neighbor. He was watching me. "You just passing through?" he asked. "Yeah, just need a place to crash for the night." A small pause. Then he smiled. "Well, you picked a good spot. Real quiet out here. Peaceful." I nodded but didn't respond. Something about his tone gave me pause. Like he was trying too hard to make it sound normal. Then he gestured to his fire. "You're welcome to join me if you're up for some company. I've got an extra chair." Sitting by the fire. I hesitated. Normally, I wouldn't mind chatting with a fellow traveler. But something about this guy, or maybe just the whole place, felt off. Still, I didn't want to be rude. "Sure," I said. I grabbed a beer from my RV's fridge and walked over, settling into the chair across from him. The fire cast long, flickering shadows on his face, making him look older, more weathered. We talked for a while about travel routes, places we'd seen, strange roadside attractions. Normal small talk. But as the minutes passed, I started noticing little things. The fire didn't give off much heat. Even sitting close, I barely felt warmth. His RV door was open, but I never saw any lights on inside. Every so often, there was a faint static hum in the air, like the kind you hear when a radio isn't tuned to any station. I brushed it off. I was just tired. Then he asked something that made my stomach tighten. "You ever forget a whole night?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You ever wake up somewhere and not remember how you got there?" I let out a short laugh, trying to keep things light. I mean, maybe after a few too many drinks. He didn't laugh. He just stared into the fire. "Yeah, it happens to me all the time." A chill crawled up my spine. Before I could respond, he changed the subject, just like that. Back to road stories, back to meaningless conversation. I should have left then, but I didn't. The first sign of wrongness. An hour passed. Maybe more. The fire never died down, never crackled, never shifted. Just a steady orange glow, frozen in place. Eventually I stood up, stretching. "Well, I should probably get some sleep. Long drive tomorrow." He nodded. "Yeah, probably a good idea." I took a step toward my RV. Then he said it. "See you in the morning." It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Like he knew something I didn't. Like he'd seen this play out before. I hesitated but forced a smile. "Yeah, see you then." Then I went inside my RV, locked the door, and told myself to stop overthinking things. But as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the unease in my gut. Something about that conversation, it felt off. Staged almost. Like a script that had been recited before. I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the silence outside. And just as I started to drift off, I heard it. A soft static hum, coming from somewhere inside my RV. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head toward the small kitchenette, toward the tiny old radio I kept on the counter. It was on, but I hadn't touched it. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The static crackled softly, whispering through the dim space. And underneath it, just barely audible, was a voice. A familiar voice. My own. I scrambled out of bed and shut the radio off, breathing hard. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. For a long time, I just stood there, gripping the counter. Then finally, I exhaled, shook my head, and muttered, "I'm just tired." I climbed back into bed, pulled the covers over me, told myself I'd feel better in the morning, and eventually sleep took me. Something is wrong. I woke up to the sunlight streaming through the window. For a brief, blissful moment, everything felt normal. Then I stepped outside and saw it. The camper's RV. It was different. The sleek white exterior was gone. In its place was an old, rusted wreck. The windows were shattered. The door hung open on broken hinges. The fire pit, cold, untouched, filled with ash, like it had been abandoned for years. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of it. I turned to the other RVs, looking for someone, anyone, but no one else was outside. The place was too quiet. I swallowed hard and took a cautious step toward the abandoned RV. Then another. The door was wide open. A dark interior stretched beyond, and from inside, faint and distorted, came a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, crackling hum, like a radio tuned to nothing. like something waiting for me to step inside. And then, a voice. See you in the morning. 1. Trying to rationalize. I stared at the rusted RV, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The camper from last night, the friendly man who'd invited me to sit by his fire, the sleek white RV with the warm glow inside, was gone. And in its place was this, the shell of a long-abandoned wreck. The windows were shattered, glass littering the ground like teeth spit out after a brutal fight. The paint was almost entirely peeled away, exposing corroded metal eaten by time. The tires were deflated, sinking the vehicle slightly into the dirt, like it had been here for years. I swallowed hard. This had to be a mistake. Maybe I was misremembering where I parked. Maybe his RV was further down the lot. Maybe someone had towed his out and dumped this one here overnight. But deep down, I knew better. I took a shaky step closer. The door to the ruined camper hung slightly open, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. Inside, the darkness stretched beyond the threshold, too deep, too empty. And then that sound again. A soft, crackling hum, like a radio stuck between stations. It came from inside. A part of me, some stubborn, rational part, wanted to step in, to take a look, to prove to myself that this was just a weird, explainable mistake. But the rest of me, the part screaming that something was very, very wrong, kept my feet firmly rooted in place. I took a slow step back, and then another. I turned and walked, no half-jogged, back to my own RV, my pulse hammering in my ears. I just needed to leave. Now, the first attempt to leave. I yanked my door open and climbed inside, locking it behind me as if that would somehow help. Sliding into the driver's seat, I shoved the key into the ignition, twisting hard. Click. Nothing. I froze. Tried again. Click. Click. The engine didn't even try to turn over. No sputtering, no half-hearted attempt to start, just silence. I let out a shaky breath, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Not now. Not here. I had plenty of gas. I'd just driven in last night. The battery was fine. There was no reason my RV shouldn't start. I closed my eyes, forcing my breath to slow. Okay, maybe I'd flooded the engine. Maybe I needed to wait a few minutes, let it settle. I checked my phone. No service. Not even a single bar. I glanced outside. The other RVs still sat in their places. Silent. Still. I hadn't seen anyone come out all morning. Maybe I just wasn't looking at the right time. Maybe they were still asleep. Maybe. I stopped myself. Too many maybes. I took another breath and grabbed my keys, stepping out of the RV. If I couldn't get service, I'd just go find someone in the office. There had to be a manager, or at least someone who could give me a jump start. The office that should have been there. I walked down the narrow dirt path leading toward where I'd seen the office sign last night. The trees loomed overhead, their branches knotted together like grasping fingers. Sunlight barely filtered through, casting jagged shadows across the ground. As I walked, I felt it again, that heavy stillness. The air was thick, like a storm was about to break, but the sky above was perfectly clear. The further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sound of a highway, just my own breathing. And then up ahead, I saw the office, or at least what was left of it. The small building looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, the door slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. The wooden sign that had once read office was cracked in half, barely hanging from its post. This wasn't possible. I had seen lights on inside last night. I had passed by when I pulled in. The front desk was lit, and there were papers on the counter, a radio playing softly. Now it looked like no one had stepped inside for decades. I hesitated at the threshold, staring into the black void beyond the door. That same crackling hum drifted from within. The same sound from my radio last night. A cold chill ran down my spine. I stepped back. No, I wasn't going in there. I turned on my heel and headed back toward the main lot. I needed to find another camper. Now, the other RVs. As I walked, I scanned the other vehicles. Most had their curtains drawn. Some had small signs of life, shoes sitting outside a door, a camping chair left unfolded. I approached the nearest one, knocking on the side. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Hello? Nothing. I moved to the next RV, then the next. Each time, the same result. Silence. I felt my chest tighten. I couldn't be the only person here. I had seen the other RVs last night. There had to be someone. I reached the last one, the biggest in the lot. A massive Class A motorhome with tinted windows, and an expensive-looking setup. I banged on the door. Hard. Hello? Still nothing. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. A cold sense of dread curled in my gut. I shouldn't go in. I shouldn't. But I pushed the door open anyway. The empty RV. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick with dust. It shouldn't have been. The exterior looked brand new, but inside, it felt like no one had been here for years. The furniture was covered in white sheets. The floor was coated in grime. The kitchen counters were bare, save for a single old radio. And it was on, crackling softly, whispering static. My stomach twisted. I stepped further inside, my footsteps kicking up small clouds of dust. Then I saw them. Pictures, scattered across the small dining table. Faded, yellowed at the edges. I hesitated before picking one up. It was a group photo. Campers sitting around a fire, smiling at the camera. And at the center, the man from last night. Same flannel. Same baseball cap. The date at the bottom? 1987. My breath caught in my throat. I shuffled through the other photos, hands shaking. More campers. Different groups, different years. But in every single one, the same man, the same smile. Like he'd been here forever. Like he'd never left. The radio crackled louder. I turned toward it. The static shifted, warping into something almost like a voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew one thing. It was saying my name. The realization. I stumbled back, knocking into the table, the photos scattering to the floor. No, this wasn't real. I turned and ran, out of the RV, across the lot, back to my own. I fumbled with the door, scrambling inside, locking it behind me. I needed to leave. I didn't care if my RV wouldn't start. I would run, I would hike, I would do whatever it took. And then, a voice, right outside my door. See you in the morning. I froze, heart slamming against my ribs. My breath hitched in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. A shadow stood just beyond the glass, unmoving, waiting, and in the distance, across the campground, the abandoned RV's door swung open. The night that wouldn't end. I sat inside my RV, breath shallow, hands gripping the armrests of my seat. The figure outside my window hadn't moved. It stood there, silent, waiting. And then it was gone. No footsteps. No sound. Just vanished. I barely had time to process it before I noticed something else. Outside, the sky was still dark. My phone showed 4:35 a.m. I had been watching the minutes crawl by, waiting for the first sliver of sunrise to break over the trees, but it never came. The night wasn't ending, and something deep inside me whispered that it wouldn't. Not until I was gone, or until I wasn't me anymore. The voices in the static. I reached for my radio, intending to turn it off completely. I couldn't stand the low crackling hum anymore, the constant buzzing between empty channels. But as my fingers touched the dial, the static shifted. Beneath the hissing, a voice broke through. It was faint, garbled, like a whisper traveling across a long distance. I leaned in. At first, I could only make out fragments. He sees you. You need to before it's too late. The signal warbled, cutting in and out, the words half lost in distortion. I turned the dial slowly, trying to clear the signal. Then, get out! The radio screamed the words at full volume. I flinched back as the noise blasted through my small space, rattling the walls, filling every inch of air. And just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence. The screen on the radio flickered once, and then shut off completely. A dead, blank void. I sat there, hands shaking. The voice, whoever it was, sounded desperate. Like they were trying to warn me. Like they were trying to save me. But from what? Or who? I already knew the answer. The rusted RV that shouldn't be there. I forced myself to move, pushing away the growing sense of suffocation. I needed to see it again. That abandoned, rusted RV. Maybe if I went back, if I checked it in the daylight, or whatever was supposed to be daylight, I could find some logical explanation. Maybe I'd find evidence that this was all just a sick prank. So against every screaming instinct in my body, I left my RV and walked toward the wreck. The moment I stepped outside, the temperature dropped. The air was wrong, thin, empty. The trees that once stood so tall and dense at the edges of the campground now seemed farther away, as if the space around me was stretching, or shrinking. The rusted RV sat exactly where it had been before, its skeletal frame looming in the dim moonlight. But this time, the door was open. I stopped in my tracks. I hadn't touched it. The last time I saw it, it was only slightly ajar. Now it hung wide open, yawning into pure blackness. Like an invitation. Or a trap. A faint, rancid smell wafted from inside. Damp rot, rusted metal, something decayed. I took a step closer, then another. I shouldn't have. But I did. The impossible interior. I braced myself before stepping inside. The first thing I noticed? The floor was clean. The filth and dust that should have coated the inside of such an old, decaying vehicle were gone. Instead, the space was a lived-in. A small table with 2 chairs sat near the window. A kitchen counter lined the far wall, complete with an old-fashioned stove. A set of boots rested neatly by the door. It looked almost normal, but it wasn't, because the further I walked, the bigger it became. It didn't make sense. From the outside, this RV was barely 20 feet long. But inside, the hallway stretched too far, too deep, too endless. I turned back toward the door, and froze. The door was gone. The photographs. Panic clawed at my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I reached out, running my hands along the walls, feeling for something, anything, that would prove this wasn't happening. And that's when I saw them. The photographs. They lined the walls, row after row, frame after frame. Each one the same. Groups of campers. Smiling. Sitting around a fire. At first, they looked normal. But as I moved closer, I saw the truth. In every photo, the same man was there. The ghostly camper. Sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in the background, but always present. His smile never changed. Not once. And as I stared at them, heart hammering, I saw something worse. The final row of photos were of me, last night, sitting by the fire with him. My blood ran cold. The last photo in the row, an empty chair, waiting. The ghost in the reflection. A movement in the corner of my eye made me spin around. But the RV was empty. I turned back toward the photos. Only then did I realize there was a mirror between them. And in it, I wasn't alone. I sucked in a sharp breath, too afraid to move. Standing just behind me, reflected in the glass, was a figure. Not fully formed, a shape more than a person. But the face, that same unchanging smile. Then, a whisper. "You're staying, aren't you?" My breath hitched. The lights inside the RV flickered. And in the reflection, I saw the truth. I was never supposed to leave. Not after last night. Not after sitting by that fire. I had already been claimed. The escape that wasn't an escape. I didn't think. I just ran. Straight down the impossible hallway, past the photos, past the shadows closing in around me. Somehow, I found the exit, a door that shouldn't have been there. I burst through it, and slammed onto the hard ground. I gasped for breath, my hands sinking into damp soil. I was outside, back at the campground. Or at least, I thought I was, because something was wrong. The air was heavier. The trees were taller, too tall, reaching into a sky that wasn't quite right. The other RVs sat in perfect stillness, but their colors were fading. They were rusting, decaying, like the one I had just escaped from. Like I was looking at a place that had been abandoned for decades. I turned to my own RV. It was still there, but something was different. The windows were fogged over, and behind the glass, a figure sat in the driver's seat. A shadow of me. It slowly turned its head, and smiled. The other me. I couldn't move. My own reflection was sitting inside my RV. It wasn't a trick of the glass. It wasn't my imagination. The figure in the driver's seat was me. Same hoodie, same posture, same vacant expression, except for the smile. Not a normal smile. Something wider. Unnatural. Wrong. And then it lifted a hand. Not to wave. Not to signal. But to press one single finger to its lips. Shh. I stumbled backward. No. No. I turned away from my RV, eyes darting wildly across the empty campground. There had to be a way out of this. I just had to move. The unnatural stillness. I forced my legs to work, pushing myself toward the nearest occupied RV. The one that had been across from me all night. The one where I had seen people earlier. I reached the door and pounded on it. "Hello. Please, I need help." Nothing. No sound. No movement. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. And that's when I noticed. The whole campground was silent. Not just quiet. Dead. No rustling trees. No chirping insects. No distant hum of an engine or the creak of settling metal. Just nothing. Like the world itself had stopped. I gritted my teeth, refusing to accept it. I banged on the door again, harder this time. Please, open up. The door swung open. On its own. I stepped back, heart hammering. It was dark inside. Too dark. The kind of dark that didn't feel empty, but full. Something was in there. Something that didn't want to be seen. Then, from the blackness, a whisper. You're knocking on the wrong door. The rotting campground. I bolted. Didn't look back. Didn't stop. I just ran. But the moment I turned away from that empty RV, the campground changed. The trees twisted. Their trunks bloated and split like something had forced its way out from the inside. The air smelled of damp rot, of old metal and stagnant water. And the RVs, they were decaying. Not in real time, no, that would have made sense. They were already ruined. Like this place had been abandoned for decades. Even my own RV. The windows were cracked. The paint was peeling. The tires were flat. Like it had been sitting here, forgotten, for years. But that wasn't the worst part. No. The worst part was the people. The campers who weren't campers anymore. They were standing outside their RVs now. The other campers, or what was left of them. Their faces were hollow, sunken, their skin pale and cracked like dried mud. And their eyes were just black voids. They didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there watching, like they were waiting for something. For me. And then, from behind me, a voice I knew. You should have stayed by the fire. I turned, and there he was. The ghostly camper. Still wearing the same clothes, the same baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. The same smile. Unchanged. Unaging. Like he had always been here. Like he always would be. I took a step back. Then another. But he followed. You sat with us, he said, voice eerily calm. That means you stay. I shook my head. No. I was just... His smile widened. You sat. You shared the fire. Now it's your turn. I didn't understand. Until I looked back at the other campers. At their faces. At their rotting, vacant expressions. And I knew. They had all been me once. Just campers. Just visitors. Just passing through. Until they sat by the fire. Until they met him. And then, they never left. The never-ending night. I spun back to him, desperate. I don't belong here, I choked out. I need to go home. His head tilted slightly, like he was amused. Home, he echoed. You think you have a home to go back to? I turned to my RV again, praying, asterisk, begging, asterisk, that it would still be real. But it was gone. The rusted-out shell remained, but the inside? Empty. Like no one had ever lived there. Like no one had ever been inside. I staggered back, breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But then, I saw it. A flicker. A momentary break in the nightmare. Through the trees, beyond the decayed campground. A road. Not part of this place. Something real. I didn't think. I ran. The road that led nowhere. I pushed myself forward, lungs burning. The ghostly camper didn't stop me. None of them did. They just watched. Smiling. I tore through the trees, the branches scratching at my arms, my face. The road was right there. I could make it. I had to. I burst onto the pavement, my feet hitting the solid ground. And I almost collapsed with relief. I was out. I turned back, expecting to see the campground. But there was nothing. Just dark forest stretching for miles. No RVs. No fire. No campers. No him. I sucked in a sharp breath, heart racing. It was gone. I was safe. I turned to face the road again. That's when I saw them. The signs. They lined the roadside, battered and faded. And the words. I felt my stomach drop. Camp closed. Do not enter. No trespassing. No camping. Site abandoned. 1985. The final realization. My breath hitched. No, that couldn't be right. I had just been there. I had seen the fire, met the campers, talked to. I stopped. Hands trembling. I pulled out my phone, praying for a signal. 1 bar. Enough. I typed in the name of the campground. And when the page loaded, I felt my entire body go cold. The campground had been shut down for 40 years. The land had been abandoned after a fire. A fire that had killed everyone there. I was still staring at the screen when my reflection flickered. The screen turned black, and in its glassy surface, I saw him, the ghostly camper, smiling, standing right behind me. Nowhere feels real. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The reflection on my phone screen flickered. He was behind me, the ghostly camper, Not in my imagination. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the dim road. He was standing right there, smiling. I spun around, expecting to see him. But there was nothing. Just empty road. Just dark trees. I turned back to my phone, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the screen again. But my reflection was still there. And he was still in it. Closer. The road that led in circles. I stumbled away from the screen, nearly dropping my phone in the process. This was just shock. That's all. I needed to think. I needed to get out of here. I turned to the road, eyes darting up and down the long, empty stretch of pavement. Which way had I come from? Left? Right? I didn't know. Panic gripped my chest. I should have remembered. I had just run here. But when I looked at the trees, the pavement, the faded road signs, none of it felt familiar. Like the world had shifted when I wasn't looking. Like the road itself had moved. My pulse pounded as I made a choice and ran. But the moment I did, the road curved. Not a normal turn. Not a bend in the path. It was like the world was forcing me back. And as I ran, the trees on either side warped. RVs flickered between them, hollow, rusted husks of what they once were. Campfires burned low in the distance, surrounded by people who weren't people anymore. And ahead of me, the sign. The same battered sign I had just passed. I had looped back. No, not just looped. I had never left. The hollow campers. I forced myself to stop, panting, stomach twisting with dread. I wasn't getting out this way. I had to try something else. I turned, eyes scanning for anything that looked different. And I saw them. The campers. All standing at the treeline. Watching me. Their faces were slack, empty of emotion. But their eyes were black pits. Deep and endless. The same as his. I took a step back. And they took a step forward. A slow, synchronized movement. I turned to run. And they were already ahead of me. Standing in a perfect line along the road, blocking the way. The ghostly camper's offer. And then he stepped forward. The ghostly camper. Still wearing the same jacket, the same hat, the same impossible smile. Like he hadn't changed in years. Like time had never touched him. He didn't speak right away. Just stared at me, head slightly tilted. Like he was waiting. Like he was giving me time to understand what I already knew. When he did speak, his voice was quiet. Calm. You sat with us. I clenched my jaw, fists curling. No. He smiled. Yes, you did. I shook my head. I didn't know. Doesn't matter. He took another step forward. You shared the fire. Another step. Now it's your turn. The truth of the campground. I felt the cold truth press down on me like a weight. I had joined them. Not willingly. Not with intent. But that didn't matter. I had sat by the fire. I had listened to his stories. I had let him in. And now, I was part of this. Part of them. Unless, there had to be a way out. I looked past him, scanning the trees, the road, the distant, decayed RVs. There was always a way out. I just had to find it. And fast. Breaking the cycle. I forced myself to take a deep breath, fighting against the fear sinking into my bones. If this place ran on rules, then I had to break them. The first rule, the fire. It started at the fire. It ended at the fire. I turned sharply, eyes landing on the dying embers glowing faintly in the distance. And I ran toward it. The ghostly camper didn't stop me. Neither did the others. They just watched, as if curious, as if no one had ever tried this before. A fire that never dies. I skidded to a stop in front of the fire pit, breath ragged. The embers pulsed weakly, like they were breathing, like they were alive. I reached out, ignoring the heat, and grabbed a handful of ash. And the moment I did, the entire campground shifted. The trees groaned. The ground rippled. The air thickened like something huge had just woken up. A low whisper rushed through the trees, the RVs, the wind. Not words, just a feeling, a warning. I clenched my fist tighter, letting the ash crumble between my fingers. I knew what I had to do. I had to snuff it out. The fire. The thing that tied me here. The thing that tied them here. I reached for the water jug by the fire pit, heart pounding. I had one chance. One moment. I lifted the jug, and the fire flared up. A last-ditch effort to keep itself alive. I poured the water. The flames hissed, sputtered, and went dark. The end that wasn't the end. The world stopped. No movement. No sound. Not even a whisper. The air felt different. Lighter. Like something had let go. I turned, breath catching. The campers were gone. The RVs were gone. The ghostly camper was gone. Just empty ground. An abandoned, forgotten campsite. Like nothing had ever been here. Like it had never existed. I swallowed hard, chest rising and falling with deep, shaky breaths. It was over. It had to be over. The reflection that wasn't mine. I walked back to the road, still half expecting something to pull me back. But nothing did. The sun was starting to rise in the distance, casting weak light over the empty stretch of pavement. I pulled out my phone again, checking for service. 5 bars. Like it had never been gone. I opened the camera just to see, and that's when I noticed. My reflection. It was there, but it wasn't right. The way I stood, the way I tilted my head, the way my lips curved up in a too wide smile. I didn't move, but my reflection did. It lifted a single hand and pressed one finger to its lips. Shh. The final realization. I dropped the phone. No. I wasn't free. I had broken the cycle, but something else had taken its place. Something worse. I wasn't trapped in the campground anymore. I had brought it with me, and I wasn't alone. I would never be alone again. Next story. The arrival. I wasn't planning on staying the night. The campground was more of a last-minute decision than anything else. I had been driving for hours, just me and the endless stretch of road, my fingers gripping the wheel a little too tightly as exhaustion crept in. I told myself I'd pull over at the next decent-looking rest stop, maybe sleep in my RV for a couple of hours before continuing on. That's when I saw the sign. Whispering Pines Campground, 2 miles ahead. I hesitated, but fatigue won. A proper campsite sounded better than some dimly lit gas station lot. So, I turned onto the narrow road leading into the woods, watching as the headlights cut through the darkness. The place was nearly empty when I arrived. A single-lane dirt path wound through the towering trees, leading to a scattering of numbered campsites. A few other RVs and tents were set up here and there, but most of the spots were vacant. It had that eerie, end-of-season emptiness, like a place that had once been bustling with life but was now waiting for something unseen. I pulled into campsite number 17, right near the edge of the lot, and turned off the engine. Silence settled around me like a thick fog. That's when I noticed the picnic table. It sat at the adjacent campsite, #18, directly in my line of sight. Unlike the others, which were weathered and splintered, this one looked strangely pristine. The wood was smooth, the surface clean, as if it had just been placed there. And more importantly, it was set for a meal. Plates, silverware, a full spread of food. I frowned, squinting in the dim light. There was something almost too perfect about it. A plate of steaming roast chicken, a bowl of mashed potatoes, a glass of red wine. Everything arranged neatly, as though someone had just stepped away and would be back any second. But there was no sign of anyone. No flickering lantern, no murmured conversation, no rustling from an unseen camper. Just the table, waiting. The first night. I forced myself to look away, shaking off the creeping unease curling around my spine. It's probably nothing. Someone probably set it up and walked off for a bit. I busied myself with settling in, locking the doors, shutting the blinds, turning on the small overhead light in my RV. But the longer I sat there, the more I found myself glancing toward the table. The food hadn't been touched. Even as time passed and the night deepened, the table remained unchanged. No shifting shadows of people returning. No flicker of movement. Just stillness. I debated checking it out, maybe calling out to see if anyone was around. But a strange sense of hesitation gripped me, something deep and instinctual. It wasn't fear exactly, but a whisper of unease in the back of my mind. Instead, I crawled into bed, the steady patter of crickets and rustling leaves filling the silence. At some point, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Then, a noise. A faint, almost imperceptible clink of silverware. I shot upright, heart pounding. The sound had been quiet, but in the stillness of the campground, it was enough to jolt me awake. I turned toward the window. The blinds were still drawn, but something in me didn't want to look. Instead, I listened. The crickets had stopped. The wind had stilled. And in that suffocating silence, I heard it again. Clink, like someone gently adjusting a fork on porcelain. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, cautiously, I peeled back the edge of the blind, just enough to get a glimpse outside. The table was still there. Still set. Still untouched. The food, the plates, the wine, nothing had moved. And yet, I had heard something. I watched for a few more minutes, expecting someone to emerge from the darkness, expecting movement in the tree line. But there was nothing. Just the empty campsite and that perfectly arranged meal. After a while, I convinced myself I had imagined the sound. Maybe the wind had knocked something over. Maybe I had dreamt it. I let the blinds fall shut and forced myself back under the covers. But sleep didn't come easy. Morning confusion. I must have drifted off eventually because when I woke up, the sun was filtering through the trees, painting golden streaks across the walls of my RV. For a brief moment, everything felt normal again. The unease from the night before felt distant, irrational. Until I stepped outside. Until I saw the picnic table. It was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No plates. No food. No wine. Just bare, weathered wood, as though nothing had ever been there at all. I stared, my pulse quickening. Someone must have cleaned it up. Someone must have taken everything before I woke up. But I had never heard anyone. And the ground around the table? Undisturbed. No footprints. No tire tracks. No sign of anyone walking through the dewy grass. Just emptiness. Questions without answers. I spent the morning trying to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a prank, some weird, elaborate trick played by another camper. Maybe someone had simply cleaned up quietly before sunrise. But when I asked around, the few campers I spoke to just gave me blank looks. Picnic table? What picnic table? I gestured toward the empty campsite. Right there. The one with the food last night. A middle-aged couple shook their heads. No one's been at that site for weeks. We've been here a few days, and it's been empty the whole time. My stomach tightened. That wasn't possible. I had seen it. I had heard the silverware move. The table had been set. Hadn't it? I thanked them and walked back toward my RV, forcing myself to stay calm. But doubt was already creeping in. Had I imagined it? Had the exhaustion from driving messed with my mind? Or was something else happening here? That evening, I told myself I wouldn't look. I wouldn't check. But as the sun began to dip behind the trees, painting the sky in burnt oranges and deep purples, I felt the weight of my own curiosity. I didn't want to see it again, but I knew that I would. As darkness fell and shadows stretched long across the ground, I finally turned my unease settles in. That evening, I told myself I wouldn't check. I wouldn't look. But the moment the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the campground, I felt that same pull. That terrible, creeping curiosity. I sat inside my RV, trying to distract myself. I made dinner, scrolled through my phone, and even put on a podcast. But no matter what I did, my eyes kept flicking to the blinds. My ears stayed tuned to the silence outside, waiting, expecting. And then, just as the last streak of daylight faded, I smelled it. Roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, warm bread, the same exact meal as last night. A heavy weight settled in my chest. I hadn't even looked outside yet, but I knew. I didn't want to check. I needed to check. With slow, careful movements, I crept toward the window and peeled back the blind just enough to see outside. My stomach twisted. The picnic table was set again. The food was arranged exactly as it had been the night before, as if someone had pressed rewind on reality itself. But the worst part, the food was steaming. Fresh. Untouched. Someone had just placed it there. And yet, no one was around. I scanned the campsite, my pulse hammering in my ears. The neighboring spots were empty, the surrounding trees still. It didn't make sense. How was the food getting there? My breath came shallow. Something about the scene felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite explain. I pulled the blinds shut. I locked the door. And I told myself that I would not, under any circumstances, step outside tonight. A silent presence. Hours passed. I tried to ignore the table, but the thought of it festered in my mind. No matter how much I tried to focus on something else, my mind kept circling back to the food, the plates, the eerie stillness of it all. Then, a noise. A faint shuffle of movement just outside my RV. Not the sound of the wind. Not an animal. Something deliberate. Someone was there. I froze, my grip tightening on the blanket draped over me. The world outside had gone silent. The crickets, the rustling of leaves, all gone. I strained to listen. A soft, rhythmic clink, like silverware tapping against porcelain. I swallowed hard, my body rigid with unease. It was coming from the picnic table. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling slightly. Maybe if I turned on my flashlight, I could scare off whoever was there. Maybe I could catch them in the act. Before I could turn on the light, another sound made my blood run cold. A chair scraped against the ground. Someone was sitting down. The breath hitched in my throat. I wasn't alone. Slowly, too slowly, I reached for the blind, lifting it just enough to see through. The table was still there. The food was still there. But the chair, it was pulled out, like someone had just sat down. And yet, no one was there. A chill skittered down my spine. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. I kept watching, eyes locked on that empty space. Then, in the dim glow of the moonlight, a fork lifted off the table. It hovered in the air for a single, agonizing second. Then it dropped. Clatter. I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't see anyone, but something unseen was there, eating, using the table, the disappearing feast. I didn't sleep. I barely even moved. I stayed curled up on the couch, gripping my blanket like a lifeline, my ears straining for any sound outside. Eventually, the noises stopped. The crickets returned. The trees swayed gently once more. Still I waited. Only when the first light of dawn crept through the blinds did I finally work up the courage to check. With shaky hands, I unlocked the RV door and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves. Birds chirped in the distance, the world feeling normal again. But when I turned to look at the picnic table, it was empty. No plates, no food, no sign that anything had been there at all. Like the night before, it had vanished. As if it had never existed in the first place. My stomach twisted. Had I imagined it? Had I dreamed the whole thing? Or was something playing with me? I rubbed my arms, suddenly feeling exposed. I needed answers, and I wasn't leaving until I found them. Digging for clues. Later that day, I walked up to the small campground office, a tiny wooden building near the entrance of the park. The woman at the front desk looked up from her magazine as I stepped inside. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with graying hair and sharp, knowing eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. I hesitated. How was I supposed to explain this without sounding crazy? I cleared my throat. I was just wondering, has anyone else ever mentioned the picnic table at Site 18? Her expression didn't change. What about it? I licked my lips. I saw food on it last night. Like a full meal. But no one was there. And then this morning it was gone. I expected her to laugh. To dismiss me. Instead, her gaze darkened. She set her magazine down. "You didn't eat it, did you?" My stomach turned to ice. "What? The food?" Her voice was firmer now. "Did you eat any of it?" I shook my head quickly. "No, I just saw it." The woman exhaled slowly, studying me with an unreadable expression. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "You should leave before nightfall." A heavy silence filled the space between us. I swallowed hard. "Why?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the window, as if checking for something. Finally, she murmured, "Because whoever that food is for isn't you." A shiver crawled down my spine. I opened my mouth to press for more, but she had already picked up her magazine again, her message clear. The conversation was over, and I was on my own. The decision to stay. As I walked back to my RV, my mind raced. What did she mean? Who or what was the food for? More importantly, what would happen if I stayed? Any rational person would have packed up right then, driven away. But I couldn't. Something about this was pulling me in. I had to know the truth. That night, as the sun sank below the trees, I made my decision. I wasn't just going to watch from the safety of my RV. I was going to step outside. I was going to sit at the table. And I was going to wait for whatever came to claim the meal. Because I needed to see it. Even if I regretted it. Even if it was the last mistake I ever made. The night of waiting. I had made up my mind. I wasn't just going to watch from my RV tonight. I was going to sit at the table. To wait. To see what or who came to claim the food. A deep, gnawing part of me knew this was a mistake, but curiosity had burrowed into my brain like a parasite. The unanswered questions, the eerie stillness, it all demanded an explanation. So as the sun bled out across the treetops, I grabbed a lantern, zipped up my jacket, and stepped outside. The campground was empty, quiet. The distant hum of cicadas filled the air. I walked toward the picnic table, my boots crunching against the dirt. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then I smelled it again. That same warm, home-cooked aroma. Roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, fresh, buttered bread. And there it was. The meal was back, neatly arranged. Plates, silverware, napkins, as if set for a guest who never arrived. I swallowed hard and lowered myself onto the bench. The air changed instantly. The moment I sat, a deep, oppressive stillness fell over the area. The air was too heavy, too thick, like the entire campground was holding its breath. I clenched my hands into fists on my lap. Something was watching me. Not from the trees. Not from the road. Right here. At the table. The empty chair. The chair across from me remained empty, but I could feel something sitting there. An unseen presence. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I wanted to run. My body screamed at me to get up, to flee back into the RV and lock the doors. But I didn't. I stayed. I forced myself to breathe evenly. And then, before I could even process what was happening, the chair moved. Just an inch. A slow, scraping sound as if someone had shifted their weight. A spike of ice shot through my spine. I kept my eyes locked on that empty space. Then, a fork lifted off the table. I stopped breathing. It didn't fall. Didn't tremble. It just floated. Hung there, as if being held by something I couldn't see. Then, ever so slowly, the fork pressed into the mashed potatoes. It scooped up a bite and rose to nothing, like someone or something was eating. My vision blurred at the edges. My brain refused to accept what I was seeing. The bite disappeared. The fork lowered back to the plate. I let out a shaky exhale. My limbs were frozen. I couldn't move. I was dining with a ghost. A whisper in the night. I wanted to scream, to run, to get away from whatever invisible thing was sitting inches from me. But the moment I even shifted, the fork clinked against the plate. I went still. And then, a whisper, right beside my ear, so close I could feel the breath against my skin. Stay. I lurched from the bench, my body acting before my brain could process. My lantern tipped, casting wild shadows as I scrambled backward, knocking over the chair behind me. I stumbled, fell hard onto the ground. The picnic table was empty again. The chair across from me was pushed in. The meal remained untouched. The fork rested neatly beside the plate, like nothing had happened, like it had never happened. But I knew I hadn't imagined it, because my ear was still cold, like someone had just whispered against my skin. And my hands were shaking so badly I could barely push myself up. The vanishing evidence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside my locked RV, knees pulled to my chest, my brain looping over what had just happened. It was real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. I saw it, heard it, felt it, and the worst part, the whisper wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It sounded lonely. A chill crawled down my spine. By the time morning rolled around, I was exhausted, my body aching from staying tense all night. I needed proof. Something to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. So, as soon as the sun rose, I forced myself to step outside again. The air was crisp, the scent of damp leaves thick in my nose. Birds chirped in the distance, the world feeling deceptively normal. I turned to the picnic table, and my stomach dropped. It was empty. No plates. No silverware. No trace of the meal. Like it had never been there. The old journal. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I drove back to the campground office. The woman from before was still there, flipping through a newspaper. When she saw me, she sighed. You stayed. I clenched my fists. What the hell is going on with that picnic table? She was silent for a long moment. Then, with a heavy breath, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out something. A journal. Faded. Worn. Pages yellowed with age. She slid it across to me. Read page 36. I flipped to the page, my pulse hammering. The handwriting was old, scribbled in fading ink. June 12, 1978. James never came home. I waited at the picnic table, just like we planned. I set dinner out, but he never showed. I waited until the food went cold, but still he never came. I don't know where he is. I don't know if he's coming back. But I'll wait. I'll always wait. My fingers trembled as I turned the page. June 13, 1978. Dinner is ready. James will be here soon. The same words were repeated on the next page. And the next. And the next. Dozens of entries. Over and over. For months. I swallowed hard. She never stopped waiting. I looked up at the woman behind the desk, my voice hoarse. Who wrote this? Her expression was unreadable. A woman named Margaret. She used to camp at Site 18 every summer, waiting for her husband. My skin prickled. What happened to her? The woman hesitated, then said, she died in 1983. Car accident. Never made it back. A thick, suffocating silence filled the air. I felt cold, sick, because suddenly, everything made sense. The table, the food, the whisper. It wasn't a ghost waiting for a meal. It was a meal waiting for a ghost. The final night. I should have left. I should have left. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret, about the food appearing every evening, about the voice that whispered for me to stay. She was still waiting, still hoping. A deep, terrible sadness settled in my chest. And I made a decision. For the first time, I would eat the meal. I would break the cycle. I would give Margaret her final goodbye, even if it meant seeing what came after. The last meal. I made my decision. Tonight, I wasn't just going to watch. I wasn't just going to sit at the table. I was going to eat, to see what happened when the meal was finally accepted. I had no idea if this would break the loop, if it would let her move on, or if it would only invite something worse. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to finish what she started. The night air was deathly still. The campground was empty, abandoned. I could hear nothing but my own heartbeat as I stepped toward the picnic table. The moment I reached it, the smell hit me. That same impossible, home-cooked aroma. But this time it was stronger, overpowering. I swallowed hard and lowered myself onto the bench. And there it was. The meal was waiting, plates gleaming in the lantern light, steam rising from the food. And across from me, the empty chair. The chair that wasn't empty. Not really. I clenched my hands into fists to keep them from shaking. Then slowly, I picked up the fork. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. I expected something to happen the moment I touched it. A sound, a voice, a presence pressing in close. But nothing came. The forest remained silent. I lifted the fork, my pulse hammering, and I took a bite. The food was warm, fresh. It melted in my mouth, the rich, buttery potatoes sliding down my throat. But the second I swallowed, the lantern flickered, the air shifted, and then, a hand touched my wrist. The ghost across from me. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs. But there was no one there, only the chair. And yet, I could still feel it, the lingering cold pressure on my skin, like invisible fingers had just curled around my wrist. I clutched my arm, my breath coming fast and shallow. And then, the chair moved, not by an inch this time. It dragged backward, scraping against the ground, like someone was standing up, watching me. My body locked up. I wanted to run, to bolt back to my RV, to never return to this cursed table. But something stopped me. A whisper. Soft. Faint. Thank you. The sound sent an icy shiver straight through my core. It was right next to me, right beside my ear. The voice of a woman. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to look straight ahead. And for the first time, I saw her. Margaret. A figure stood at the edge of the lantern light. A woman. Her hair was dark, damp like she had just stepped out of a storm. Her clothes were faded, stuck in a time long past. Her eyes, sunken, hollow, desperate. But the worst part, she was half there. Her form flickered, edges blurring in and out of existence, like a dying signal on an old television, like she was fighting to stay. A deep, aching dread rooted me to the bench. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Margaret stared at me, her lips trembling. Then, ever so slowly, she lifted her hand, pointing. My breath caught in my throat, not at the gesture, not at the ghost standing before me, but at what she was pointing at. Something was coming. The woods behind me went silent. Every chirping insect, every rustling leaf gone, like the whole world had been placed on mute. And then, I heard it, a sound from deep in the forest. A footstep, a single, deliberate step against the dirt. Then another, closer. My stomach twisted into knots. The footsteps weren't normal. They were wrong. Too heavy. Too slow. Like something enormous was dragging itself toward me. Margaret's face twisted with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. She turned to me, eyes wide, her mouth moving. She was saying something, but I couldn't hear her. The air had turned thick, suffocating. And the footsteps. They were getting closer. The thing in the woods. I finally forced myself to move. I turned around, and what I saw, I will never forget. Between the trees, something shifted. A shape. Tall. Too tall. Its limbs were long, unnatural. Its head hung low, almost dragging against its chest. And its eyes. God. Its eyes. Two burning holes in the dark, like someone had carved them out of reality itself. And they were locked onto me. A paralyzing, animal terror overtook me. I had to run. Now. But before I could, the thing moved. It lunged. Run. Margaret screamed. A blood-curdling, desperate sound. And then she was gone. Her body flickered, vanished like a snuffed-out flame, leaving me alone. With it, I didn't think. I bolted. My legs nearly collapsed under me as I sprinted toward my RV. I could hear it following, branches snapping, leaves crunching, the weight of something massive moving fast. Too fast. I crashed into the side of my RV, fumbling with the door handle. My hands were shaking too hard to grip it. The footsteps. Right behind me. I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside. And then, a loud, deafening thud. The entire RV shook, like something had slammed against it. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Silence. I waited. Seconds dragged by. I didn't move, didn't dare breathe. Then, a soft scraping sound against the door. A whisper. Low. Hungry. Stay. I screamed. The final glance. I don't remember falling asleep. But when I woke up, the sun was rising. The birds were chirping. The world had returned to normal, like nothing had happened. But when I turned to look at the picnic table, I saw it. One last thing. The meal was gone. The plates were empty. The silverware gone. And on the tabletop, there was a single word, carved into the wood. Goodbye. The morning after. I didn't move for a long time. The sun had risen. Birds were chirping. The world had returned to its normal rhythm. Like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't nearly died. I sat on the floor of my RV, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the locked door. My fingers ached from gripping the blanket too hard in my sleep. At some point during the night, my mind had shut down. The fear had been too much, too real, and my body had done the only thing it could. It gave out. But the nightmare hadn't left me. Not entirely, because I could still hear it. That last whisper. Stay. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stand. I had to leave. Now. A final look at the table. I stepped outside. The air was fresh, crisp with morning dew. The clearing looked just as it had before, like any other campground. But when my gaze landed on the picnic table, a chill ran down my spine. The plates were gone, the silverware gone, and the carved word in the wood stood out like a fresh wound. Goodbye. The message sat there, silent and final. I should have felt relieved, like the chapter had ended, like Margaret had moved on. But instead, a terrible thought crawled into my mind. What if she wasn't the one who left that message? What if it was something else? Something that wanted me to believe it was over? So I would let my guard down. A shudder rippled through me. I needed to get out of here. The drive that wasn't right. I threw my things into the RV without thinking. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to leave. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. Relief washed over me as I pressed the gas, pulling away from the sight. The table disappeared into the trees behind me. But as I drove, something felt wrong. The trees outside the window blurred together. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and no matter how far I went, the sun never seemed to move. My hands tightened on the wheel. I had driven this way before. The highway should have led me back to town. But the longer I drove, the more I felt like I was going in circles, like the road was looping back on itself, like I wasn't really leaving. A bead of sweat trickled down my neck. I pressed the gas harder, but the road just stretched on, endless, unchanging. And then, I saw something in the distance, a shape, something familiar. The impossible sight. I slowed down, my stomach clenched. No. Up ahead, through the thinning trees, I saw a clearing, a campsite, a familiar spot, and in the very center of it, a picnic table, waiting for me, exactly where I had left it. My breath caught in my throat. I slammed on the brakes. I couldn't be back here. It wasn't possible. But no matter how many times I blinked, it didn't go away. The table was still there. And worse, there was food on it. Fresh. Waiting. A plate. A chair pulled out. Like I had never left. It wants me back. My whole body was ice. My fingers trembled against the steering wheel. I had left. I had driven away. I had been on the road for hours. Hadn't I? My mind felt dizzy, warped, like I had stepped out of time, like I had never really left this place. A deep, gnawing horror clawed at my chest. I reached for my phone. No signal, not even a single bar. The screen glowed back at me empty, useless, a presence pressed in around me, like something was watching, waiting. I could feel it lingering in the trees. Not just her, something else, something older, hungrier, and it wanted me to sit down, to stay. To become part of the cycle, a new offering, The thought hit me like a fist. This was never about Margaret. She wasn't the one keeping this place alive. She had been caught in it. A sacrifice. A piece of something much bigger. And now, it wanted another. It wanted me. The realization sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins. I had to get out of here. For real this time. I threw the RV into reverse. The tires skidded against the dirt. I didn't care if I ran over the fire pit, the table, anything. I just needed to move. The picnic table blurred as I spun the wheel. I wasn't staying. I wasn't becoming part of this place. But then, something moved. In my rearview mirror. The final glimpse. At first, I thought it was Margaret. Her shape flickered, standing just outside the trees. Watching. Silent. But then, another figure appeared. Then another. And another. Shapes crawled from the forest. Dozens of them. Men. Women. Children. All half there. All hollow-eyed. Trapped. And behind them, the tall thing. The one from last night. Still watching. Still waiting. A cold, sick realization sank into my stomach. They were all part of it. All trapped in this cycle. And if I didn't leave now, I would be too. The escape that wasn't. I floored the gas. The RV shot backward onto the highway. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove. The road stretched on, endless as before. But this time, I didn't let it trick me. I kept my foot on the gas, white-knuckled, refusing to acknowledge the whispers at my back. Refusing to acknowledge the scraping sounds against my RV's exterior. I drove until the trees changed. Until the sky shifted. Until I saw another car. And then, I was back. Back in the real world. Back where the sun actually moved in the sky. But something inside me knew the truth. I had escaped. But I wasn't free. A lingering presence. Weeks passed. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I ignored the calls from the campground manager. Ignored the emails about a left-behind plate at Site 14. Ignored the feeling of being watched every time I sat down for a meal. But deep down I knew. It wasn't over. And then one evening, I heard it. A sound from outside my RV. A chair scraping against the ground. Like someone was sitting at my picnic table, waiting for me to join them. I didn't look. I never looked. But I felt it. A presence. An invitation. And then, a soft, familiar whisper. Stay.